My name is Jane Ursel. I'm from Resolve, Manitoba, and I'm a member of the research team, and it's my pleasure to chair this very impressive panel. We are on a very tight time frame, so I'm going to give an extremely brief introduction to all our panelists right now, and then they will come up in the order that they are currently sitting. Our first speaker is Jackie Campbell, who is the Anna Wells Chair at Johns Hopkins University School of Nursing. She has been doing advocacy, policy work, and research in the area of violence against women for many years, since the 1980s. She has published over 220 articles and 7 books in the field. And yesterday, with the team of researchers, she shared some very important lessons learned that she did on a major homicide study in the United States. Following Jackie, we have Dawn Lavell-Harvard, who is Dr. Lavell-Harvard is the director of the First People's House of Learning at Trent University. She is also an adjunct professor at the University of Western Ontario. Her research focuses on addressing achievement gaps and fostering academic success for Aboriginal students. And she will be speaking after Jackie, and unfortunately has to leave right away because she has to be in another city in a couple of hours. So, following Dr. Lavell-Harvard is Dr. Deborah Doherty. She is currently the Executive Director of Public Legal Education and Information Services in New Brunswick. She has been actively engaged in family violence research and programming for nearly 30 years, and her research on female domestic homicide analyzes risk factors in a rural context. Following her will be Dr. Sepali Guruge. I probably said that wrong, sorry. She is the Daphne Cockwell School of Nursing Research Chair in Urban Health. Her research focuses on immigrant women's health. In particular, she examines violence against women throughout the migration process. And finally, last but not least, is Dr. Linda Baker. She is the Director of Violence Against Women Learning Network. And for over 20 years, most of her research and clinical work has involved adolescent and adult offenders and children and adults who have been victims of abuse and involved with criminal and family court systems. We have a timekeeper, and we're going to try to stay on time because we have people coming and going at a furious rate. So it's a pleasure to welcome Jackie and to hear her wise words.
Well, first of all, let me say how honored I am to be here. It has been an awesome day. I have learned so much. And if any of our opening panel are still here, I'll hear your words in my head forever. And I cried a lot this morning, and I told somebody today, I guess when I stop crying, that I ought to get out of the work. So we're charged with addressing safety planning for vulnerable populations. And when I heard the opening this morning from the elder, I didn't know much, I have to admit, about the 7 fires prophecy, so of course you Google it, right? And I found out some more. But I'm feeling like we are probably in an era where we do have to make those choices as a global planet, as a global people. And especially for someone in the States, I feel particularly vulnerable to a country's government that seems absolutely bent and determined to do more to befoul the earth and make our waters full of disrespect. And that my country seems to want to go down the path of more prosperity for the few. And so does our world, rather than a good life for everyone. So, I'm going to keep that in my head and do everything I can to change the policy in my country. I like a lot of what Canada is doing now. I'm always tempted to move north, except what keeps me, of course, in my country is these grandchildren. So all of you that have heard me talk, I always start out with pictures of the grandchildren. And my piece here is to ask all of you, if anybody after the presentation has any thoughts of how I get those incredibly privileged grandchildren to really deeply recognize their privilege and to recognize the biases that I know they're growing up with. My daughter says, well, Mom, you taught us not to be racist. But I'm like, yeah, but see, that's not good enough. You have to live it. You have to think about it every day. So if you have any tips for me, let me know. Now, what I'm supposed to do is talk about safety planning for vulnerable and marginalized populations. What Myrna told me is the way it's defined in this homicide prevention initiative is Aboriginal populations, immigrant populations, rural, remote. I would say we ought to add the LGBTQ continuum to that also. Now, I'll confess from the outset, I got nothing for you in terms of rural and remote. The Intimate Partner Femicide study was done primarily on urban populations. There's a few rural cases in there. But I am thrilled that there are so many people here that are thinking about it, and I'm looking to my colleague, Donna, to address it in this presentation. The danger assessment, which many of you know about, was developed for women. It's in order to help women recognize the danger in their relationship with an abusive man. Now, part of the danger assessment, in terms of its history, I first developed it based on a small domestic violence homicide study in Dayton, Ohio, small town. And based on the work I did in that study, I realized I needed to work with abused women if I was ever going to decrease murder of women. And so I started on a journey doing that, working in leading support groups and shelters in Detroit first and then in other places in the country. And also teaching my students, my nursing students, to recognize abused women in their practice, talking to a lot of abused women and realizing they oftentimes were underestimating their risk of being killed. They would tell me the story and I think, oh my goodness, it sounds way too much like one of those homicide cases I reviewed. But yet, I'm more scared than she is. And that's when I learned to recognize clinically that normal minimization, put it in the back of your head kind of process that women do, abused women do. And not all of them are at high risk, but those that are oftentimes underestimate their risk. So I developed the danger assessment, getting the wording for the items, and it's available on the website. It's available for free. They promised me even if I get hit by a bus tomorrow, it'll be up there for free. I've sold my soul, not totally, but the rights to Hopkins so that it will always be available. And the wording of the danger assessment came from the women. The notion of choking strangulation went on the danger assessment back in 1986 because women told me that that was one thing that scared them. That was one thing that made them think he might be capable of killing her. And the original danger assessment, I've done the danger assessment myself with 2,200 women that I have records of, and probably more than that. So I've used it, and one of the most important parts of the danger assessment is the calendar. This makes it interactive. This helps her come to her own realization of the pattern of domestic violence. It cuts through that normal minimization. Now, the calendar is built on the notion that she's strong, resourceful, smart. And like all adult learners, we learn much better. It's much more powerful if we see it for ourselves in our own situation rather than somebody telling us what to do. And this is a quote from a woman in Alberta, Canada. You actually see your own roller coaster ride. It's on the calendar. Now, it was further refined in the national U.S. domestic violence femicide study. Tested with ROC curve analysis, all of that's available, and all of the articles related to the danger assessment are on the danger assessment website. We have also developed a version for immigrant women, DAI. Immigrant women, again, in the United States, so it hasn't been tested further, needs further development and testing. We're working on that right now. But that's also available on the danger assessment website. We also have a DAR for same-sex female couples, and that we're continuing to work on also. We also have a DA5, which is a short form for healthcare providers. It was actually developed mostly by a Canadian physician, Carolyn Snyder, who's now in Toronto. We have revised and worked on that further, and we have a publication coming out on that in 2018. The DALE was developed in collaboration with the Jeannie Geiger Crisis Center in order to help them identify which cases of domestic violence needed to be handled by a high-risk team. So it's calibrated slightly differently than the other danger assessments in order to do that. That DALE also, there's a publication coming out on that, but that's available on the danger assessment website. But that's more around identifying cases that need heavy-duty, highly collaborative risk management. It's also in the DOVE intervention, which is for pregnant women in prenatal, either home visitation or prenatal care. That intervention has been tested and found to significantly reduce repeat domestic violence. That's also being used in the NFP, which is the family partnership. It's the home visitation program. Oh, David Olds was just nurse family partnership. Got it. And Dana Jack and Marilyn Ford Gilbo are using the danger assessment in their home visitation programs, and they're developing an intervention specifically for NFP nurses to do with domestic violence victim. The LAP is a short form of the danger assessment, and note it's a lethality assessment protocol. It's not just a lethality assessment. There's a protocol that goes with it. And sometimes you hear people say, oh, well, we use the LAP. You know, we just ask these questions, and there we go. We know who's at high risk. The protocol that goes with it is that the police officer informs the woman or the survivor, and they're using it with males as well as females, that they are at high risk. According to the LAP, it's calibrated to overestimate risk. And gets them in touch with domestic violence advocacy right there on the scene. Doesn't give them a phone number to call that they don't, but gets them in touch with domestic violence advocates right there on the scene. Offers them the phone, they don't have to talk, but that's the protocol part. So it's not just, and you may notice, all of these are intended to connect women at high risk with domestic violence services so she can make choices what to do. Wanted to give you a little bit of data from my collaboration with the Alberta Council of Women's Shelters. Carolyn Gerard is out there somewhere. This project we did many years ago, but we wanted to keep track of what happened when the Alberta Council of Women's Shelters decided that the danger assessment would be used in all of their shelters as women were admitted within the first 48 to 72 or 24 to 72 hours after admission. So domestic violence advocates were concerned about doing that with the danger assessment. They were particularly concerned about the calendar, concerned that it would re-traumatize women. So that was in part why we embarked on this research. 46% of the participants in this research were Aboriginal, 31% English Canadian, other visible minorities 7%, and 5% foreign-born. So importantly, the Alberta Council of Women's Shelters wanted to modify the calendar, which anybody's free to do, anything they want to do to make it better for women to fill out. They wanted to add emotional abuse as well as the physical abuse, the 1 through 5 on the calendar. They wanted to add emotional abuse, financial abuse, sexual assault, and spiritual abuse, and how often that happened, and put it on the calendar. One thing that we're doing now with all of our calendars is actually adding when choking or strangulation happens on the calendar. So we had 180 respondents who gave us in-depth, it wasn't in-depth interviews, it was they gave us the answer to open-ended questions about what it was like for you to complete the danger assessment and the calendar. And the thematic analysis, first of all, a lot of women said, yeah, it's hard to do. It's distressing, it's upsetting. A lot of women cried. But it was also part of a healing process. First of all, by increasing awareness, decreasing minimization. I love that quote about I'm always trying to minimize my experiences, and she hadn't even been to support group yet. So I don't know how she learned that terminology. So she already had that in her head. But then also women talking about it being a healing experience. I love that in terms of loosen my breathing, which we know is something that we do when we do finally start to relax. Also increase their realization of danger. And the theme of strengthening resolve, those quotes, and those are just examples of quotes. There was many other women that said something like this, is what makes me feel like the danger assessment is worth doing in terms of strengthening women's resolve. So also we measured the outcomes, and those of you that are researchers in the room, this was lousy research. It was pre-post only. It was, it's not, no control group, none of that good stuff, no follow-up over time, but just pre-post in terms of women marking their danger more after doing the danger assessment. Well, that makes sense. But the ready to take action, significantly more. Ready to get help from the shelter personnel and ready to get help from police. So based on that work with Alberta Council of Women's Shelters, we also worked with the Indigenous shelter directors and their staff in order to make the danger assessment more culturally appropriate for Indigenous women in the on-reserve shelters. And so they came up with the DA circle design. It's part of the Walking the Path project that was for children who were in homes where there had been domestic violence, Indigenous children. So it was designed to be a little bit more culturally appropriate, using culturally significant symbols on the calendar, and also doing the calendar in a month process, more appropriate, a season process, more appropriate to a medicine wheel type concept. And women, rather than the regular danger assessment calendar, women are asked to work backwards, starting with yesterday, work backwards, because we remember yesterday better than further back. But to take advantage of the more storytelling traditions, women were told to dive into any season they wanted to and work backwards and forwards within that season to mark the abusive incidents, as is done on the regular danger assessment. Now, we have not formally tested the DA circle, but the notion of safety planning, based in part at least on the danger assessment, is that women are aware of the level of danger in their situation, their risk of homicide. That's one piece of information that they need in order to do safety planning, I believe. And ideally coming to that realization herself rather than being told. But if she is told, if it's by a healthcare provider or the police or a domestic violence advocate, look, you're at high risk. If you do the weighted scoring on the danger assessment, you're at extreme danger. That this gives her a voice saying, and she may have suspected it all along. We have some quotes from some other women. One woman said, "Hey, this is no news flash. I knew he was scary. But this does give me some backing to push the system more." So then the safety planning you can do is based in part on how dangerous he is. And then the safety planning needs to be contextualized to her situation, to her culture, to other sources of discrimination and violence against her, so that it's not just about her personal situation, so that it's also the context has to take into account. And Diane Redsky was talking today about her program, the Spirit of Peace program, which I think is awesome, where and she can talk to you more about it if you're interested. Then we developed the MyPlan app. Now, Nancy Glass, my colleague, my friend, was the one that first developed the MyPlan app, but the danger assessment is in it. And importantly, I don't know if this will work, yeah. So the danger assessment, the woman is asked, first of all, a little bit about her background. If she says she's in a relationship with another woman, and there's problems in the relationship, there's some first identification that the relationship has issues. The word violence is avoided at the beginning. Let me back up a little bit. It can also be done by a family member or a friend. So if it's not by the woman herself and it identifies that at first, starts off with internet safety, app safety strategies, et cetera. There's a get out of this app and go to a planning your, I don't know what it is, your work life or something. It goes straight to that if you want it to. So there is some safety strategies built into that app. You can also see the little leaf that's on the front of it, and it just says My Plan. So it's not it doesn't scream out abuse or circle of safety or anything like that. And then it asks her what her priorities are in life. Are her priorities her children? Which, every abused woman I've ever talked to that has children, that's number one. But if she doesn't have children, then the safety planning that's offered is not about children. And then after it goes through some relationship myths, and that's one of the things we're tailoring to Indigenous women in our work with the MyPlan. Then it asks the questions that are on the danger assessment, and it scores it for her. And you can see there it gives where she is on the levels of danger. And we did some work with some women that said, 6 months later, they said, oh, I was in the red zone. I remember that about that app. I don't remember anything else, but I do remember I was in the red zone. So it's a powerful message of where she is in terms of risk of homicide. Then it tailors, and it's brilliant programming. James Case is the person that programmed it. It tailors the safety strategies that are offered to her, to that background information, to her priorities, and to her level of danger. And so this does not take the place of domestic violence advocacy, but it's an extra tool that we can use for people that aren't ready to talk to you wonderful, fabulous, best people advocates. And that's always one of the choices that's given, is in the United States, it's the National Domestic Violence Hotline. Now, there's a Canadian version called I CAN that Marilyn Ford Gilbo has developed, and they've done an evaluation of it. Those results are in. It's not yet published, and they're eventually planning to get it in the App Store also. The only one that's in the App Store now, both kinds of app stores, is the My Plan. It's also iSafe in New Zealand, and the evaluation of iSafe in New Zealand was very effective for Maori women, even though it was not specifically tailored that way. So what we're doing now in the United States, we're trying to develop an indigenous version of My Plan. I have a team of indigenous researchers that are in charge of it. We started out with in-depth interviews of service providers and abused indigenous women. It will have the DA circle in there for the danger assessment. By the way, in My Plan, if you say you're in a relationship with another woman, you get the DAR rather than the regular danger assessment. We're tailoring the priorities, the myths, the safety planning strategies for indigenous women in the United States. We'll get to Canada one of these days. And we're also doing the same thing with the same grant money from NIH, so we can't go global. But and we're calling it, by the way, Our Circle. You can see a pattern in these things. And the immigrant version of My Plan is going to be called We Women. And it's based on the danger assessment for immigrant women, doing the same kinds of cultural adaptation as for Our Circle. Like, for instance, in Our Circle, a lot of the safety planning strategies are reconnecting with your spiritual practices, your traditional practices, those kinds of things like what I've been hearing about today. I CAN, that team here in Canada, like I said, the findings are in press, and there's an I HEAL online strategy that was also developed by Marilyn Ford Gilbo for healing after abuse. And there's a team in BC, Colleen Varco and her team, working with Aboriginal women for healing after abuse. And I do believe healing from the trauma has to be part of safety planning strategies, that we have to pay attention to healing. And I think we have to pay attention to that in our prevention programs, our dating violence prevention programs. We have to pay attention to people's experiences of trauma, whether they're Aboriginal or immigrant coming from another land, etc. That has to be part of our safety planning strategies. And I finished on time. What do you think?
Wonderful.
And this is one of the moms that I interviewed for the femicide study. So I do what she tells me.
Thank you very much. Ani, bojo, sego, segoli, skanagoa, bonjour, hello, good afternoon. Wabmimi dijnakas wikwemkon dojaba. I'm truly honored to be here with you today, and I'd like to start by acknowledging the original Indigenous inhabitants on whose territory we're gathered here today. When I started with the Native Women's Associations as a very young youth member, one of the original projects we did, when we went out and asked around all of the kitchen tables to our members, what was the biggest barrier for you and your family, for you achieving the quality of life, the kind of life you dream for your family? And 8 out of 10 of those women said it was the violence. It was the violence in their homes, in their families, in their communities. Some communities, it was as high as 95%. How can we focus on getting a job when you have a black eye? How do your kids do their homework? How do we do school projects when you're scared to go home at night? Yes, there's extremely high rates of violence in our communities. It's in fact the #1 reason that our women leave our communities. It's not for education, it's not for employment, it's to escape the violence. And now people may look at First Nations and say, well, it's because of them. This is the legacy of colonization. Violence was not part of our communities. It was not part of our tradition. Sorry, I just realized we're still looking at hers. Patriarchy, violence, misogyny was imported with the explorers and the colonizers, the same as cholera, smallpox, and all the other diseases that have infected our communities. We had equality in our societies. Our women were strong. We had matrilocal, matrilineal, and even matriarchal communities. And that's not to say that our communities were all happy, joy, and peaceful all the time. No, life was harsh. Everybody gets that. But our women had protective factors. When you were matrilocal, our women, the men joined the woman in her family. And if you were living in a wigwam in a village right next to her brothers and her uncles and her father, violence wasn't tolerated. In our communities, if a woman decided that her husband wasn't a good provider, if she decided that he was becoming violent, what she did was put his moccasins outside the door of that wigwam, and because the wigwam was the woman's property, he had to go home to his mother. That was his sign. If he came home from trapping and his moccasins were out there, that was for him to go back to his mother and to his community. We had matriarchal communities where the women had decision-making power. They couldn't tell the men what to do, but because they controlled the fruits of their produce, they controlled the corn, they controlled the food stores for the winter, they couldn't tell the men not to go on a war party or a hunting party, but they could control how much food they took with them because those stores belonged to the women. So they could say, you can go anywhere you want, but I'm giving you a day and a half worth of food. And that's how we maintained. And in the fur trade, our women were important factors in the fur trade. Their role in preparing the hides meant that they were valuable. And at the end of the fur trade, and then came the British and the assimilation and the churches and the residential schools and trying to break that equality. Because strong, empowered, equal Indigenous women was a threat to patriarchy everywhere. When those colonizers came over with this myth that men are superior and that the Creator says that the man should be the head of the family and the women and children should be subservient, if you tell them that that is the natural law from God, and then you come to a country where all of these women are running around as equals, that threatens your entire society. So of course they attacked our women. Of course it was a very deliberate program of trying to eliminate the power of our women. The Indian Act that said only men over the age of 21 could be on chief and council. The Indian Act that said an Indian was an Indian man, the wife of an Indian man, or the child of an Indian man, shows very clearly how that patriarchal, how that misogyny was brought and forced upon our people. And after generations of trying to impose that on our people, of course there's violence in our communities. But you look at the entire society, the attitudes about Indigenous women. When you have a society that has had generations of dehumanizing Indigenous people, starting right with that church, the papal bull, the doctrine of discovery that said our people were not even human. And then when you mix that with a society and patriarchal that comes and that says that women are property, of course Indigenous women become the lowest of the low in that structure, the most vulnerable. The prejudice and the stereotypes and the attitudes that come with it embodied. When my mother went to the Supreme Court because she lost her status, she lost her right to be an Indigenous woman, went all the way to the Supreme Court, and one of those Chief Justices said he couldn't understand what all the fuss was about because she had been declared no longer an Indian. He said, you would have to show that you lost something, that this was some hardship. And he said, we all know what it's like on an Indian reserve. You should be happy that a white man would marry you. You're better off. This is the kind of racism that our women face. When we go to have safety plans and you go to police, you go to courts, that's the kind of attitudes our women face. So it's no wonder they don't report. It's no wonder they don't reach out for help, because that's the kind of help we've got for generations. That racism and that prejudice, and that's unfortunately very, very common attitudes. When we talk about our women being afraid to report, afraid to reach out for help, you have to remember the history of police forces in Canada. Police forces that were used to steal our children, to take them to the residential schools. Police forces that put our parents and our elders, our chiefs, in jail when those parents refused to hand over the children to the residential schools. So of course our people are afraid to go to the police. But then when you add to that the situation in Val-d'Or, the BC Commission of Inquiry, we see that this is not just a few bad apples. This is a legacy of police forces abusing Indigenous women in this country. An RCMP officer who arrested a young Indigenous woman, and when she was in the jail, he came back after hours in his plain clothes and said he wanted to take her out because he wanted to pursue a relationship with her. And his buddies, the other RCMP officers who should have been protecting her, they laughed and they goaded him on and they said, you arrested her, do whatever you want with her. And they let him take her. That's the kind of policing we get in some of our communities. That's the way Indigenous women are treated. They're picked up for hitchhiking and asked for sexual favors in order to be driven home by the police. So it's no wonder our women are afraid to reach out. This is a huge barrier. How, if the very people who are supposed to protect you are the ones who are abusing in our communities, how do we get help? The legacy of the 60s scoop, child welfare agencies who came in and just stole our children in front of the homes, sold those children across to the US, $5,000 to $10,000 per Indigenous child. It's no wonder. A woman doesn't report because she's afraid that if she reports, she's going to lose her children. They will go into the child welfare system, and they'll never be seen again. And it's a very legitimate fear in this country. So our women would rather endure the violence than lose their children. Many of our communities, how do we change this? Police forces that want to build trust. We have tribal police forces, which can be a challenge, because in communities, if it's tribal police, everybody's related to everybody, then you have family pressures. People saying, look what you're doing to him, because we're all in the same community and they see. Remote First Nation communities, where you have policing by the Ontario Provincial Police. Some communities, they have 2-week shifts. They have as many hundreds of different police officers through that community for 2 weeks at a time. How do you have any follow-up? How do you build any trust? How do you even know what goes on from 1 month to the next when the people are there for 2 weeks and then gone? There's no follow-up. There's no relationship building. The biggest challenge to safety plans in our communities is many people have never been to a First Nation. Many people in this room have no idea what it's like. When we started doing this work, in fact, trying to advocate for shelters in our First Nation communities, I remember I was probably about 18, and I went to a local community, and the chief, he heard I was with the Native Women's Association, and he says, oh, I got a bone to pick with you. I thought, oh, Lord, here it comes, right? And he says, why are you always trying to force shelters down our throats? We don't need no shelters here. Our women were strong. Our women didn't leave. And he said, when I was growing up, yeah, my dad, if we stepped out of line, my dad took the strap to us. If my mom didn't listen, he'd slap her around. That's just part of being in a family. And I didn't know what to say, because how can you equate violence and assault with ketchup in the refrigerator? It's just something everybody has in your family. That's the unfortunate normalization of abuse after the breakdown because of the oppression, because of the residential schools, because of the 60s scoop. That's the tragic reality in many of our communities. And when we have shelters, you know that in Ontario, we now have 31 shelters on reserve. But if you stop and realize that there's 133 First Nations, that means there's over 100 First Nations where there's nowhere for our women to go. When we have rural communities, It doesn't matter if you have bus fare, there's no buses. It doesn't matter if you have money for a taxi, there's no taxis. We have a very closed system. In a First Nation is the only area where if you make a complaint, if you're in the City of London, that doesn't impact your housing, really. It wouldn't impact your job. It doesn't impact your children's schools. But in a First Nation, because everything runs through the Band Council, we had a woman make a complaint, and her partner, who she had put in jail, was actually on council. They made a Band Council resolution. She lost her home. She was forced to leave because they can do that. No other place in Canada can the local mayor and city council decide that you have to get out of your house because you've made a complaint against your husband. Nowhere. And this is, in fact, not even the remote communities. Some of our communities, we don't have roads, ice roads, or a plane ticket for $3,000 to get out. How can we escape when we're in those situations? I had a friend. She was way up north, and she was being abused. So she called us. We somehow managed to get a plane to go up there. They met us on the tarmac and turned us around. They said, go back where we don't need you here. So we couldn't get to her because they had every right on that First Nation to do that, to tell us we could not come on territory. So a month later, that woman put her baby on her back and walked 100 miles through the bush to escape. Nobody should ever have to be in that situation. And until in Canada and Ontario, we have effective transportation systems, we develop infrastructure, and we recognize that even in First Nations, our people deserve the same basic standard of living, the situation won't change. But that's why we're here today, because people like you can make a difference. And on the day when you feel like you can't do this anymore, how many people here, hands up, how many people have those days where you decide, I'm not doing this anymore, I can't take it, I'm not going into work because I can't do another day? I have those days all the time. On those days when I think I want to go crawl under a rock where violence against Indigenous women doesn't exist, I'd probably have to elbow Stephen Harper to get out of the way under there. Sorry. Those days, I had a day like that, and I was at the UN, and a woman from South America said, you know, you know about the power of the hummingbird? And I said, no. And she says, but it's on your skirt. And I said, well, actually just like this skirt because it has a stretchy waistband, so it's really good for buffets. And when I travel a lot, you know, you need that. And she said, no, the power of the hummingbird. That there was a story among her people about when the forest fires were burning and all the animals were standing around wanting to do that. One little tiny hummingbird was whipping back and forth. One drop of water. He was flying to the river, picking up one drop of water and dropping it on the flames. And all the animals started laughing and saying, what do you think you're doing? He's got his little singed wings, and without missing a beat, he said, I'm doing the best that I can. And that one drop at a time, thousands and millions of drops together become a flood. They become a torrent that can put out the fires of racism and sexism and abuse and violence. And that's why one person, one drop at a time matters. And each and every one of you here is part of that solution that is going to eventually make the change so that we don't have these kind of conferences anymore, because you are the change. Thank you.
I think Deborah, you're next. Well, Jackie and Dawn are pretty hard acts to follow, but I'm really pleased to be here and tell you a little bit about my experience doing research with intimate partner violence in rural New Brunswick, and eventually domestic homicide, female domestic homicide research for the New Brunswick Silent Witness Project. I just want to give you sort of a face of rurality in New Brunswick. We have consistently, over 100 years, been one of the most rural provinces in all of Canada. The urban rural population, the development split in New Brunswick is 1-to-1. So 48% of New Brunswickers live in rural communities, and in the 2011 census, that means in communities with less than 1,000, population of less than 1,000. I think it's sort of interesting that the rural-urban split in New Brunswick today reflects the divide in Ontario in 1921 and Quebec in 1911. So we're only a century behind in terms of that rural-urban divide. But it very much, we're not a remote province. We're not huge with long, long distances between communities, but we are a very rural province. And I first began doing domestic violence research in 1994 when Dr. Jenny Hornesty, a sociologist at UNB, became the chair of one of the first 4 teams, original teams of the Muriel McQueen Ferguson Center for Family Violence Research. And I'd been doing focus groups with rural folks on how to deliver law information in a way that reflected the lived reality of people in New Brunswick. And Jenny invited me to join that team. And so I was pleased, and as a sort of a frontline service provider, my board said, you know, we can't support you to be off doing research and interviews if it's curiosity-based. It can't just be, oh, isn't it nice to have more information? It has to be something is going to come out of this to improve women's safety, how we share information to make things safer for women, how they access law information. So that was always part of being involved in research, was to respond to the needs of the people who were victims of family violence, perpetrators, service providers, police, and so on. I guess before I talk about the domestic homicide, Jenny and I have a lot of publications, and you can read about that. So I can't go into it with only a few minutes, but you know, we found that the factors that were keeping women in abusive relationships, women could name them. They could talk about what inhibited their help-seeking behavior. And because it was participatory action research, they would tell us, this is what we need to feel safer, this is what would help us to leave. But please respect the fact that sometimes it may sound counterintuitive, but we feel safer staying than leaving. When I leave, I don't know what he's going to be thinking, doing, and what might happen. But when I'm there, I can read his moods, I can shut him down, police won't be here for an hour and a half, so I know how to make myself safe, and you have to respect that. So it was interesting, and you know, there were 2 or 3 things that stand out in that early research. One was the over and over again hearing about firearms and how they were in all rural homes, and they could often create a very real sense of imminent danger because of threats of suicide, serious drinking, and depression. And when all of those things were happening, women would say, it's the firearms in the house that are particularly disturbing. They also talked about their pets. And later, Jenny and I did a study on pets and firearms in rural homes in PEI and New Brunswick. And there were over 400 women going into transition houses that year. 70% had pets. Of those, 45% said the pets had been harmed, and of those, 40% said the pets had been killed, sometimes with their children witnessing it. So, you know, those were things we were putting out there, and I was at the time thinking, well, there's domestic homicide risk factors, but they're probably quite different, because we were being cautioned, don't extrapolate the same types of risk factors and interconnections in intimate partner violence and domestic homicide factors. But lo and behold, when I began to do domestic homicide research, I was quite surprised that, yes, they do parallel each other, that these factors that we found in rural communities were there in the domestic homicide research as well that I was doing for the New Brunswick Silent Witness Project. In that project, one of the things I found was that the clustering of risk factors was quite different than the national. I mean, a risk factor is a risk factor, but if you say, here's the top 5, and I'm thinking of like the Ontario Domestic Violence Death Review in 2008, and it would say, here are the factors, and the number 1 most common factor was pending or actual separation. And yet, what I was finding was that was not the number 1 factor. There were other factors. So just to share a few, because we don't have a lot of time, 70% of the women who were killed in New Brunswick were killed in small towns, rural locations. Well, that's not surprising. We're a rural province. But when you realize that in Ontario, the vast majority of women who were killed in domestic homicides, it happened, 55%, were killed in cities with populations of 500,000 to over 1 million. The population of our whole province is only 785,000. So, a very different dynamic going on there. So some of the factors that were quite different in addition to just rurality, geography being something that was quite different, is the women were killed while living together. So about 65% of the New Brunswick women were in intact relationships. Now that doesn't mean, and Jackie has spoken about this, that they hadn't gone back and forth, but at the time they were killed, they were in a relationship in the same home, living together. And so that number 1 recommendation that we have to promote safer leaving. Women have to get out quickly and safely and stay out safely. Yes, of course, we want the women in New Brunswick, 35% that leave and stay away to get out quickly and safely. But it just seemed that there was nothing for the women who did stay or returned. And victim services in New Brunswick, if you were dealing with the police, they would support you. You would have a danger assessment, you'd have a risk assessment, and you could do a safety plan. But you needed to be cooperating with the police. And so often women would say, okay, he's apologized, I want that no contact condition varied, we're moving back together. And there was nothing for women to mitigate their risk when they did return or if they stayed. So the 55% of the women in New Brunswick were killed, and this is about 45 cases that I look at. So I know it's not statistically significant, but it's enough that it's a trend that gives you cause to think about what we need to do. So 55% of the women were killed with firearms, but that's hunting rifles and shotguns, not handguns. Somebody said, oh, well, you went back to 1990. Your research covered a 20-year span. So things have changed. It's not like that anymore. So I had 1990 to 2010, and then I took 2010 to now and did the research all over, divided it up. And since 2010, it's still been 55% were killed with hunting rifles or firearms. It hadn't changed at all, just to look at more recent data. The murder-suicide, over 2/3 of the women were killed in murder-suicides, and more recently it seems to have escalated. In 2010 to 2005, there were 17 female domestic homicides, and 14 were murder-suicides. And they get buried, they get hidden. You don't know a lot because they don't get much coverage. They're not reported, they can't be talked about. Privacy laws and so on. And so in terms of saying in the interest of public safety, what can we learn? It's hard to learn anything from some of these deaths. 66% of the women were in common law relationships. Only 16.7% of census families in Canada are common law. In Ontario, 48% of the women were killed by a common law partner. And so I don't know what that risk factor means, and it's a well-known, that you're at greater risk if you're in a common law relationship. Alcohol, in New Brunswick, 75% of the court cases were said at sentencing, or the judge found that they were serious drinking involved, and about 70% were said to have serious addiction problems. And again, in Ontario, that was quite a bit lower. It was 42% involves excessive alcohol. So different dynamics. And when I present the findings in rural New Brunswick, people go, oh, of course, that's not a surprise to us. What's there to do on a Saturday night in New Brunswick in the summer? You look at your calendar, the majority of deaths were in the spring, summer months. So to deal with those differences, we decided to create a safety plan that would reflect the factors that were most common in New Brunswick. So this is what tomorrow I'll be talking about in my workshop, is the actual safety plan that we have created for women living in abusive relationships. And I'm pleased to say Victim Services has purchased, adopted, taken this on as a safety planning tool that they will use with women. And so if women say, I'm not cooperating anymore, I want to go back, I'm leaving, I've gone back, before a judge is supposed to, there's no counting for what a judge might do, but before the judge will remove the variance, he's supposed to say, you must go back to Victim Services and do this safety plan for living in an abusive relationship. And then there's 16 factors or situations that could put her at risk, and she doesn't have to choose all 16 and deal with them, only the ones that she feels are doable at the time or that she'd like to address. That could be threats of suicide, it could be the firearms in the home. One of the strategies when we did training for the victim service workers, and we were talking about how they could support women in some of these situations that put them at risk, we gave all the victim service workers across the province trigger locks, because women were saying the guns are out in the open, they are under the bed, and they don't have, they're not stored properly, they're not safe. Yet they all are very concerned about their children, and they're great dads. So the idea was, let's put trigger locks on the guns so that the kids stay safe. Thank you.
Many thanks to Peter and Myrna for inviting me and to let me be part of this day. And it's been an awesome day of learning, just like Jackie mentioned earlier. And I'm also honored to be part of this panel. So I've been asked to focus on immigrant and refugee women. So I'm going to talk about immigrant and refugee women and the kind of particular key challenges they face in dealing with domestic violence. Here, I am going to particularly focus on intimate partner violence, not the other kinds of domestic violence forms. I want to highlight a few key challenges that we need to keep in mind in safety planning with immigrant and refugee women who experience intimate partner violence. Before I do so, I want to highlight the fact that there is still very little published research on safety planning for and with immigrant and refugee women in Canada, in the Canadian context. One of the reasons for this is, I believe, this assumption that safety planning is safety planning. How can they be different? Before coming here in preparation of this presentation, I asked some of my research assistants to go and talk to some of the social service and settlement workers about what kind of safety planning do they do in preparation of, keeping and helping immigrant women living or staying in intimate partner violence relationships. Often they were told, well, what's different? It's the same. Safety planning is safety planning. My talk is based on the kind of research that I have been doing with immigrant women. It's been for over 20 years that I have been working with immigrant communities, focusing on immigrant women's health. A considerable portion of this research was on intimate partner violence. And in case if you are interested in learning more about the research that I have done in different immigrant and refugee communities, feel free to go to www.immigrant-health-research.ca. It's one word, immigrant-health-research.ca.com. Doesn't matter. Anyways, so I want to start with a project that I did recently 2 years ago. I conducted focus groups in 6 languages with immigrant women in Toronto who had experienced intimate partner violence. And women across all 6 language groups said that they had never received information about their rights in Canada, and they did not know where to get such information. Some of you may disagree with me, but these are the women who came to these focus groups who had experienced intimate partner violence telling me. And more than half of these women had been in the country for more than 5 years, and all of them had spent that time in Toronto, of all the places where you would think there are plenty of social service settlement agencies working with immigrant women. And so I want to ask you this question: whose responsibility is it to make this information available to all women coming to Canada in a language the women can understand, and at a time they can actually digest such information? If we wait to give this information to the women after they have experienced intimate partner violence at a moment of crisis, it may be too late for some women. Moving on, let's say they know their rights in Canada. Who will ensure that they will have their rights honored? The women in my studies told us again and again that they personally knew other women who had gone to service providers and were subsequently sent to immigration officers and were then deported back to their countries of origin. When they know this, would they go and seek help? So what crime did these women do to be deported back to their countries? They came forward to ask for help to deal with domestic violence. I still recall the horrific situation a woman went through in dealing with her abusive husband. She said that one day after all of these things happened to her, after her children went to school, she went to the closest immigration office and stood outside crying for 2 hours, trying to decide what's worse. What should she do? Going inside or going home? After 2 hours of thinking through the situation, she said she went home to her abusive husband. Imagine what must have gone through this woman's mind. And when we talk about safety planning, what should we be thinking about in working with a woman like this? Some women in my studies have said that the police officers who responded to their 911 call listened to their husbands who were fluent in English, and were convinced that women were the abusers. Some women talked about being put in jail with no access to a translator or an interpreter for days. Some talked about going to court with translators who were assigned to them who were not fluent in their language or who knew their husband well, thus jeopardized their case by not translating accurately. As a result, some had lost custody of their children. Some women talked about their close friends who were sent back to their home countries while their abusive husbands remained in Canada with their Canadian-born children. And these women are back home and working hard to send financial support for their children in Canada. These women's rights have been violated time and time again, yet we often focus on culture blaming. To me, this is about how we, as a society, continue to fail these women. You may be aware that immigrant women who are equally skilled and equally educated as their husbands get much less pay when employed in the same job in Canada. You may be aware that even when an immigrant woman and her husband have equal job skills and equal education and training, the Canadian government automatically places the woman in the position of the dependent. Why? This happens even when the woman has more education, more employability, and more language skills. I'll give you an example. Many years back, my husband and I decided to apply for Canadian citizenship. I filled out the citizenship application forms for both of us and mailed them in the same envelope. And at the time of this application, my husband was a full-time student. He was doing his PhD. Nonetheless, he was a student at the time. At the same university where I was a full-time tenured professor. And I had completed all my education, bachelor's, master's, PhD, and postdoctoral work in Canada, on top of my education in 2 other countries before coming to Canada. The letter we received from the citizenship office was sent to my husband, and I was placed as his wife. So it wasn't addressed to me, it wasn't addressed to both of us. It was addressed to my husband. So imagine the power the Canadian government officials had chosen to give to a husband. So this happens every day. This is not one rare incident. Now I also want to highlight a few key problems women face when they seek health, social, and settlement workers and other service providers' help. Often service providers focus on getting the woman to leave an abusive husband. A newcomer woman who is dependent on her husband to obtain her permanent residency in Canada may not want to leave her relationship until she obtains her permanent residency papers. This is a careful decision a woman might arrive at in order to make her and her children's life a bit more stable in Canada. Leaving her marital home is not an easy journey for immigrant and refugee women. Some immigrant women may be married to abusive men who were born in Canada. You may have heard about mail order brides. And women may not know anybody other than their own husbands and children. Women risk losing their children and extended family, and along with that social, economic, and cultural safety, security that they might desperately need in a foreign land. Service providers' paternalistic approach in getting the women to leave an abusive husband, thinking that this will make everything all right, may not necessarily help the woman cope with the situation. In fact, this may mean the woman might not come back to seek help. Another issue I want to highlight is the lack of portability of services. Women seeking help may need to access to housing, child support, legal support, help with immigration applications, language and employment training, or getting their credentials assessed. The service providers and women I interviewed often talk about the expectation that women have to come to them. Women have to go to the service provider to receive services. They see this issue in terms of a time factor, a geography factor, a commuting factor, a financial factor, and a legal factor. Look at the number of factors the service providers identify why they can't go to the communities that they work with. If a woman takes public transportation to get to an agency that provides services in her own language, depending on where she lives, she might need 1 to 2 hours to get there and meet with service providers and get back home. This is assuming that she knows about the place, she knows how to get there, and she has the financial means to get there. Women participants have also told me that their husbands would be calling home to check on them. So they are terrified, petrified to be gone for that long. There is no system in most places where health professionals, social workers, and settlement workers can meet women in their homes or nearby in order to improve women's access to service providers without jeopardizing women's safety. This is one of the key reasons why we should include families, deliberately include families and communities in safety planning. But of course, I am talking about these things based on my research in the Greater Toronto area. But in your geographical context, with the communities that you work with, this might be different. And this is also tied to another issue that we see often, the lack of connection and coordination between the various health, social service, and settlement organizations and other services. Often women talk about their frustration with having to go to so many different places and agencies which are often located in different parts of the city in a place like Toronto, to get the support they need in planning their own and their children's safety. How can we make this easy for the women and their children to come and get help? Some of these may not be a surprise to you, but I raise them because as service providers, researchers, and policymakers, we need to pay attention to these. We need to go beyond the focus on culture and culture blaming. In conclusion, I urge all of us to advocate for systemic and structural solutions when we are thinking about safety planning so that immigrant and refugee women can feel safe in this great country. Thank you.
Children. Now, I know you're sitting there thinking, wow, they left her to last. Maybe they thought the time would all run out. But really, it's because children are in rural and remote communities. Children are in immigrant and refugee families. Children are in indigenous communities. And children are with their mothers. They're with their parents. And so we not only have to look at children and safety planning in terms of their developmental stage. What do we do when we're working with children and we're talking safety? But we have to also look at that child's context. Which of these contexts is that child in? And then adjust the safety plan accordingly. Now, I've watched how fast 15 minutes goes, so I'm just going to fling through my slides, just saying some of the things that I think are most important. The first is that when we want to do safety planning, obviously that's to increase safety with children, but it's about personal agency. It's how within a given situation to increase their ability to stay safe, to cope. The challenge with safety planning with children is how, and youth, is how to do that without increasing their sense of responsibility for everyone's safety in the family, including their mothers and their own. So it's a delicate balance, and the messaging and the way we do that safety planning, it is important. I believe it can be done, but we need to always have in mind, how do we do safety planning without adding to their sense of responsibility or guilt? When we do safety planning for children, one of the dangers is that somehow it becomes segmented because there's a lot of different systems involved with children. Child protection services, children's mental health, and there's a lot of separation at times and lack of collaboration and coordination. And safety planning for children must be one piece, an essential piece, but one piece of a broader, collaborated, coordinated community response that involves safety planning with their mother, and they should be aligned. And we must never lose sight that, for the most part, a child's safety and well-being is directly related to the safety and well-being of their mother. So we can't isolate safety planning with children and youth. We need to make sure that we're looking at the whole picture in terms of risk assessment, risk management, safety planning for the adults, but also safety planning for children. We also need to make sure that we're actually talking to the child and listening to the child. And when we talk to that child, that means joining with the child where they are, finding out their language. In most cases, that means they're not going to talk about domestic violence. They're going to talk about the fighting that happens in their family. They're going to talk about dad's temper. and how concerning his temper is, but they're not going to talk about domestic violence. We have to listen to their experiences. And what we know about children is they're not passive participants in the drama in their home that's happening. They're active participants. They're worrying. I have not met a child who lives with violence who isn't already engaged in some type of safety planning. From our perspective, we may feel that their safety planning may put them at increased risk, but there's elements of that safety planning they're already engaged in, blocking out the sounds, turning up that TV, putting on headphones, hiding under a bed. There's elements of what has come natural to them that we can usually build on in terms of a safety plan. The reason we want to build on it because is what's come natural to a person, that's their instinct, and if we build on that, we're more likely to have success with the child. We mentioned the developmental stage. Safety plans, sometimes you'll read a brochure on safety planning, and it gives you the idea that if we understood safety plans for children, that there's just a safety plan, and we do it with each child, and yes, we may change it just a little bit. But no, they need to be very individualized. Just as Jackie was saying, safety planning for adults, for women, needs to be individualized. It has to be individualized because of their age and developmental level, remembering that age and developmental level don't always go together. We need to be aware of mental health concerns and physical health, all of these things. The relationship to the parents. I think of Maha's talk this morning in terms of coming from Lebanon and not wanting to make that call to police because you don't call authorities in her culture. And then if we understand that about relationship to parents and the context, then we adjust the safety plan, even knowing there's key components to a safety plan, to be more likely that it works for that child. We also need to take into consideration the circumstances. Is there access to the abusive parent? And what does that look like? What's happening? What's already in place for safety? And we need to take those things into consideration. And we may need a special safety plan for when the child is spending time with the parent who's been abusive. Is the child also experiencing abuse? Have they experienced abuse from the abusive partner? And all of those circumstances need to be taken into consideration. The other thing is, like with all safety plans, we have to revisit and revise them regularly. We can't do it once in our busy schedules and check, that's looked after, because circumstances change. And that's the advantage of collaboration and working together, because perhaps if a child is at school, then there's a change that's noticed by a teacher or a change by a mental health counselor, that if they're in the know and aware of the safety plan, the risks and the safety factors, then we're more likely of not letting something fall between the gaps, and we're more likely to be able to wrap around that child. So there's core safety messages that make most safety plans with children. The first one is that we need to have them go somewhere that's away from the fighting, away from the loud noises and the arguments. And of course, that's going to be developmentally appropriate. Little ones, we don't want them going outside their house, especially not in Canada during the winter, but any time. But for teenagers or older children, that may be a safe place. We're not asking them to hide. We're asking them to go to a place that's away from the fighting. We also don't want them to get in the middle. And for especially older children, adolescents, they may have a strong need to stop that fighting, to intervene to protect the parent that's being harmed, their mother. And so in that sense, they may want to intervene. In safety planning, we want children to understand that they can help themselves and their mom most by not intervening. But there may be other ways they can help, like getting to a phone that's not where the fighting's going on and calling for help. So that's another part of the safety plan, calling for help. And again, just as in an immigrant and refugee family, or listening to Dawn and talking about colonization and the distrust with law enforcement agencies, that may not be an option to call the police for an Indigenous child either. But there's other people to call. And who is someone that's close? Who is someone that can be a support in the immediate or in terms of longer time? And one of the things, the Kids Helpline, we all know about the Kids Helpline, but one thing that I'm not sure that everybody knows is that they can do a three-way call. So that child doesn't have to call the police, but the Kids Helpline can bring in help as they see fit. The other message is you're not alone, and children often feel alone, and they need to know that they're not alone, and that they're not responsible, they're not to blame for the violence, and they can be a help in many ways, but they're not responsible. And I think that the message we want them also to understand at whatever age level is appropriate is that domestic violence or fighting, it's dangerous, it hurts, and it's not okay. I think the other thing in terms of blame is helping children to understand that you can't make someone be abusive towards yourself or somebody else, that people choose their behavior. And I think that for some children that's helpful. We're not going to look at all of these factors, but there's a number of additional considerations, the trauma that a child may experience and how that may impact their ability to keep themselves safe. With children, we're not just looking at physical safety ever. We're looking at psychological safety too. So when they get to that safe place, what might help them feel better? Is there a stuffed toy for a little one that's in that place? Or is there a headphone and a song that they can play if they're older? So we're looking at psychological safety too. Repetition and simplicity can't be stressed enough. And the more it's practiced, so we're not talking about one session safety planning with children and youth. We need more than one session, and we need to be able to have the repetition. I think that we sometimes forget siblings. Siblings are amazing with each other in many cases, and older siblings are so protective. But we also need to think not just doing sibling planning, because a sibling may be away from home. And we need to think about, and what would be the safety plan if Jane or John, your older brother and sister's not at home, and what would that look like? And we can never forget schools. They play such a role with some of the prevention and some of the calming activities that can be helpful when a child is in their safe place. Programs like Mind Up is amazing in terms of helping children with that. Dating violence, the 4th R, unhealthy relationships, safe dates. Some of those programs, children are already learning safety procedures. So there's lots of ins and overlaps, and the more we can reinforce messages that they're already getting, the better. I wanted to leave you with a recommended resource. There's lots of literature or increasing literature on children exposed to domestic violence. The bulk of that literature is still on the impacts experienced by children. A smaller amount is on interventions, and within that intervention literature, a very little bit is directly focused on safety planning. But we can learn a lot from the hidden nuggets within the literature, as well as from our leading advocates in North America and around the world. And I think that one of the best compilations of the information that exists was done by the BC Society of Transition Houses and EVA, Ending Violence Association of British Columbia, with support from an advisory committee that was made up of multiple agencies. And the name of it is Safety Planning with Children and Youth, a toolkit for working with children and youth exposed to domestic violence. What I want to tell you is there's actual examples of safety plans, there's links to online examples, there's actual scripts that are appropriate for different developmental stages, and lots of special considerations, like when it's custody and access issues, etc. And they've done a marvelous job. So for anybody who wants to learn more, I highly recommend this resource. Thank you.